Tonight we're going to talk a little bit about a project called ImagineCare. So we'll start out talking a little bit about what our behavior change design process looks like, what that is, and then how that process could be applied using a project that we worked on as a particular example.
All right, so from the beginning, we thought it was going to be really great to start with explaining what is behavior change design. And for that, there's a definition. So behavior change design is a set of processes and activities that are applied to create an intervention that aims to change a modifiable and defined behavior. So the first question that you might have is, how is it different from the regular design? The main difference for us, whether it's healthcare or it's not healthcare, is that we go deep into the understanding of the problem and integrate the evidence and theories, and it's grounded in the research heavily. So that's the main piece. And when it comes to the healthcare and any healthcare problems that we're trying to solve, we do a lot of research with guidelines, clinicians, stakeholders. So it's really about understanding not only what is the behavior that we're trying to change, but what is the problem space like? Are we trying to change the right behavior? Another thing is that actually sometimes it's not just the behavior. Sometimes it's also environment. There are different public health approaches to it, and some of them actually say that there are two outcomes. There are two factors. There's behavioral and environmental. Today we're going to be talking about behavior, so hence the definition, but intervention. Intervention can be anything. It can be the product, the service, it can be a digital app, like what we're going to have today, but it can also be a booklet, it can also be a visual aid, it can be anything. Intervention is anything that is trying to change your behavior. So what does our process usually looks like when we're thinking about designing for behavior change? First of all, we would usually start with outcomes and target audience. We would be looking at different types of outcomes. We'll be looking at the system outcomes, so if we're designing for a particular client, the health system, we'll be looking at what are their outcomes and what are they trying to achieve. And luckily, a lot of times our clients' outcomes are aligned with individual patient long-term outcomes, such as reduced mortality and morbidity and decreased costs. So there are also short-term outcomes, some very specific, well-defined outcomes for individual patients. But when we're talking about individual patients, we of course don't mean everyone. We are talking about some specific audience that we're designing for. So that also goes into this first step. And once we identify what is the target audience and what are the specific outcomes that we're focusing on, we go to the behaviors. So what are those behaviors that we can modify, that we can define, that we are going to be trying to change in our intervention. And performance objectives is the next step, and what it is basically, it is the sub-behaviors. So if you're thinking about behaviors such as exercise, there are certain things that go in it, so there are smaller steps. So this is what performance objectives are. If I want to exercise, I would need to know where the gym is, I would need to have the outfit, I would need to know the road, so all these like sub-behaviors would go under the performance objectives, and there'll be specific behavioral determinants that we would be aiming to target within our intervention. And what those are, they are the factors that either make the behavior more likely to happen or act as barriers. And everything until now, actually maybe one step further, goes from theory and evidence. So either primary research that we do or secondary research that we do or any kind of subject matter expert involvement or stakeholder involvement. So those behavioral determinants would be identified by looking at the literature and looking at what has been done before, what was successful, and what are those determinants that were targeted in the interventions that were successful. And this is another theoretical part of the intervention process where we are looking at the intervention functions and specific behavior change techniques, which is basically we're not designing something that's going to be just just a shiny, beautiful product. We're designing the service or the product or any type of other intervention in order for it to do something. So like, what is its function? Is it trying to educate people? Is it trying to enable some behavior? Is it trying to restructure the environment? And we're going to be talking in more details later. And there comes the next step, which is a creative process, design of all these materials and messages and activities that would go into our intervention. Those could look very different and they could feel very different because although the techniques are defined, such as goal setting or feedback, but there are multiple different ways through which we can provide the feedback, or multiple different ways that we can allow people to set goals. And there is implementation and adoption, which is the step that where we would basically be talking about how would this intervention be adopted, how people would learn about it, and where it would be implemented. And it's a whole separate planning activity, so that it will always be part of our process. And back to Jamie.
All right, so now got it kind of in the abstract, and we'll talk a little bit about how this actually plays out. So a little context to set for that. This is Dartmouth-Hitchcock. They're an academic medical center and regional health system in New Hampshire and Vermont. And they are really pretty forward-thinking in the population health space. They do a lot of research and are one of the first accountable care organizations, which is a group that kind of takes on risk financially for a population and overall tries to improve outcomes. So they have this idea of imagine a hospital that doesn't want people to visit, not because we don't care, but because we do. So thinking about being preventative, monitoring folks so that they might not realize that they're trending poorly, that maybe their blood pressure is slowly getting to a bad place, but we kind of pick up on that and prevent them from getting to a state where they would need to go to the emergency room. So they started a startup called ImagineCare, and we worked with them throughout the process just to kind of focus in on some of those behavior change angles and make sure that the overall experience design was going to be on point. So if we think about back to that process, our step one, our system outcomes, and our target population. So what we're trying to achieve here, there's this thing in healthcare called the triple aim. And that's better health, that's things like reduced mortality, like managing chronic conditions better, even getting to a point of remission for some conditions, and then improved quality of life. Better value is the second prong here. So reducing need for high-cost care. Some types of care are more costly. And then that second piece, they're really getting to the correct level of care. So sometimes you can prevent a need, but then sometimes people are just kind of going to the more costly care when they could be served at a less costly place. And also reducing need for medications, which naturally cost money. And in some health conditions, you can, through lifestyle changes, through behavior change, you can reduce your need for medication. And then the last piece of the triple aim is better care. So the actual experience of care, patient satisfaction, but also thinking about clinician satisfaction and making sure that any change that we're making to improve the experience of patients is not adding a lot of burden on the system as well. So keeping those interests balanced. So thinking about that second piece, the target population, we have our goals in place. Who could we potentially focus on to achieve some of the outcomes? So we look at a few factors, the impact of the condition in the population, to narrow down to a particular set of health conditions to focus on, the frequency as well as the cost. We also look to the available evidence about interventions and outcomes, so making sure that this is actually a condition where we can move the needle, that there's some evidence that points to the fact that change can be made. We also look at the feasibility of interventions, so technology, does it exist at a point that's going to be stable enough? Is it at a cost point that's going to be realistic? And then just logistically, again, burden on the system, making sure that that's going to be realistic to roll out. And then overlap in conditions and behavioral objectives. So thinking about, can we kind of save 3 birds with 1 stone in a way and kind of target a few different things that have common behaviors. So target population for ImagineCare, we focused in on high blood pressure, heart failure, lung disease, diabetes, and depression, which is actually kind of a comorbidity or common overlapping condition with some of these others. And when we look at the behaviors that can be changed, and the changing of these behaviors impacts these conditions, there's obviously a lot of overlap. So medication adherence is a huge impact. Self-monitoring, just being aware of your condition and being engaged in tracking your status can have impacts on your outcomes. And then nutrition, physical activity, and stress and psychological health. So one of the things I love the most about ImagineCare is that they include this angle of behavioral health as a core element. So too often in healthcare, things are very siloed, and you don't often see this kind of holistic view of the whole person. So for sake of example, we're just going to dive in a little bit more to that behavior change process and just use hypertension self-monitoring as an example for a little bit.
Okay, and before we go into even more details, do you guys have any questions? Cool. Okay, you might have after a couple slides. So we identified the outcomes, we identified the target audience. We learned that, again, based on this example that we're targeting, we want to lower blood pressure. And we also started with the example of self-monitoring, not because self-monitoring by itself is going to help us to lower blood pressure, but because this behavior is included in a set of different behaviors that's going to help us do this. So keep that in mind. It's not the exhaustive list. It's just one example. So we identified self-monitoring. We need to do something around it. So first, we're going to do a little research, talking with clinicians, looking at the guidelines, and talking with patients who we're targeting. And our process would be to align this into what is the specific granular behavior that we want to change. So what is the behavior? What does it start with? What does it end with? How often should it happen? Are there any exceptions to the case that we're trying to outline? And do we know why does this impact the outcome? Why does this specific behavior? Because we know that it does, but why? What are the reasons for that? So in case of blood pressure, we did all this process, and if we did this process this way, we'd come up with a behavioral outcome such as patients with uncontrolled blood pressure should measure their blood pressure once per day against a goal recommended by their physician and take appropriate action based on the reading. After we identified the behavioral outcome or the behavior goal, again, aligned to the process, we need to identify what are the sub-behaviors. So think about it as if you were writing an instruction to your child or to someone who needs a very simple step-by-step guidance of what to do. So we identified that we want to have patients measure their blood pressure daily and compare it to the goal and take an action based on it. So some of the questions that we would have in our research process would be, what do they need to do differently? What are those specific sub-behaviors? Are there any required resources for them? Are there any things that they need in order to carry out this behavior? Where should it occur? How often? And in this case, the list was the following. So they need to recognize the importance of monitoring blood pressure. First, they need to set the goal for behavior and outcome. And behavior in this case is that they need to do daily, the behavior itself, but there's also the outcome goal, which is their target goal that they set together with their clinicians. They need to certainly have the blood pressure cuff and know how to use it, so there's skills that are required, and they need to measure blood pressure daily, the sub-behavior itself, but also compare the reading to the goal and take appropriate action. We also added one more, that is problem solving, because we know that the only patients who won't fail are those who won't try, so we usually address this in every intervention that we design, that there is an element that helps people to get back on track and try to do the thing again. When we think about where do we go, Yep. Sure. Yeah.
That's a clinical decision.
Right, so in this case, Jamie will talk you through the example showing the deliverable and how it works in this intervention, which another good thing about ImagineCare is that ImagineCare is not trying to replace the clinician with technology. It's trying to allow technology to do what it does best and allow clinician to do what it does best. So in this case, taking action does not mean that the patient is deciding on their own what to do. It means that there's ImagineCare team that reaches out in case of something that is not appropriate, or the person always have the support that he can reach out to. So it's not the individual patient decision to take some action, and the app is providing him with those options.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most interesting things about ImagineCare is that human element and trying to, because when we take these different aspects of behavior in the abstract, as Olga mentioned, there's many ways you could potentially implement that, and one of those is outsourcing the decision making to the app. But in this case, it's really not always safe. The expert, the nurse who has that expertise is kind of the best mechanism to weigh in the system. So,
any other questions? Okay. So once we identify the sub-behaviors, we keep this information, like all this information in mind. What is the behavior? What are the sub-behaviors? But we certainly start thinking about the behavioral determinants or specific factors that we want to address in our intervention. So there might be different ways to address them, and there might be a different set of behavioral determinants depending on many things, such as your target audience, whether the behavior is modifiable or not modifiable. But what it is, and what we do for this, we use the COMP model by Susan Mickey from University College London. And what the model is, it's the framework that allows us to think about those behavioral determinants in a systemic way. So we're looking at behavior on the bottom, capabilities, opportunities, and motivation. So the idea, or like how you use it, is that you're doing the research with your target audience, you're doing the literature review, again, like secondary, primary research, like all great. We usually do the mixed method, both qualitative and quantitative research, and we try to dig out those insights about our target audience. What are their capabilities? What are their opportunities and motivation that would help this behavior be more likely to happen? Or what might be the barriers very specific to this audience that might prevent this behavior from happening? So in case of, let's say we're going to go through this example, in case of our audience has certain barriers, like not having a blood pressure cuff. This is a very significant barrier for us to think about addressing in our intervention. But more specifically, so thinking about capabilities, you'll remember all the behaviors and sub-behaviors that we outlined in the example. In order for this behavior, which is measure blood pressure daily and take appropriate action to happen, the person needs to have skills to take a blood pressure reading. He or she also needs to know about what needs to be measured, how and when. Certainly the knowledge about the goal for the outcome, and knowledge about what action is appropriate to take, whether this knowledge would come from a clinician or from some other support system, but there needs to be a knowledge that this action needs to happen. When thinking about the opportunities for this specific behavior, the person needs to have a blood pressure cuff, needs to have time to measure blood pressure, and have resources or tools that would allow action to be taken. Social opportunities, definitely relationship with a clinician is a significant factor affecting the likelihood of success, and being able to openly use blood pressure cuff in a social environment. And there are some motivational factors that would increase the likelihood of success of our interventions, such as having the goal, both for behavior and for the outcome. And there are certain rules around making the goal crisp and granular so that the person is more likely to adhere to this goal, and a whole bunch of other processes. But let's just say having a goal for this, for the purpose of this slide, and having motivation to take an action. social support and accountability, and automatic motivations. Think about it as habits or something that just happens either subconsciously or not necessarily something that is based on your reflective skills. So in this case, it's emotional reaction to conditioned behavior. Any questions?
So for your patients, do you capture their responses with these different data points?
So usually the way our process works is there are different data points, there are different data sources that we use, and one is always literature review, one is always secondary data analysis, another one is always qualitative research with patients. But as you know, the qualitative research might get, there are a lot of open-ended questions, and there are a lot of things that we might want to discover. So we don't necessarily initiate the research with a goal to pre-populate this model, but the insights that we're getting and the questions that we are asking allow us to build this structure of understanding what are the barriers. So that would be coming from primary research, qualitative and quantitative, if the client has some information about the target audience, about like some specific barriers that are key. For example, one of the projects we did with another client was that they wanted to deliver the service to, they wanted to reduce the number of amputations and ulcerations among diabetes patients. So we did analyze their research and did the primary research with patients, and the biggest barrier that was shown to be there was the opportunities. So it was just not enough the shoes with the right design. So we do this through all the different ways, through all the different types of research, but I would not say that we go to the research with this model and try to pre-populate it and make sure that we hit on every point there.
Yeah, so this model is more for the design process and generating the structure of the intervention and deciding kind of where to focus the most energies within the intervention. But to your question about individual patient level, I think the different aspects of this, again, it depends on what we find in the initial research in the design process, but for sure in ImagineCare, aspects of this come in. And as you'll see, having a blood pressure cuff is just step one. You get a blood pressure cuff, we knock that barrier out. But obviously some of these are more nuanced and setting goals. So setting goals, you kind of work with the patient
There are
one-on-one.
different ways can be leveraged. One is from a population health perspective to focus on, say, risk pool or something like that, from a payer or provider perspective. The others may be tedious measures or STARS measures to see the efficacy of your regime, right? So that's why I was asking, and then maybe through cognitive model. Those are some questions that I was asking.
Yeah, sure. When it comes to projects, to project work with clients, there are a lot of times some specific things that they are capable of addressing. Because if you think about some things here, again, this is not the model that we're going to build and say in our intervention we're going to address all of them. After we build this model, normally what happens in the process is we have a meeting with the client and we talk together through each of those important capabilities, opportunities, or motivational factors, and we think about whether it would make sense, it would be feasible, it would be like all the different criteria that they use to evaluate whether this is something they want to build. This would be one way to address it. Another way is sometimes they actually have the product in mind, and whatever the factor we are trying to change just does not fit in the product that they have in mind. So if they have a specific product or services, it might not be addressed, this determinant might not be addressed in their product because it wasn't designed this way. It wouldn't be part of it. But we want to acknowledge that it is there and try to address it. We would always aim to. Yeah.
At this point in the process, are you giving like weight and priority to these items, or are you more just like thinking of all the possibilities and dealing with that later?
Yeah, so if we'll be working in public health, there'll be certainly like one way to evaluate it, right? There'll be this analysis of what needs to happen, looking at the different levels of importance, weighing it versus like how much is the prevalence of each of those in this group. Again, we're talking about the specific project work. When we're talking about specific project work, they have their criteria. So we would usually balance the criteria that we know matter from literature and from evidence with the business goals and values of the client. So it would be somewhere in the middle. Sure.
Are you going to make some of these things concrete in this particular case, like emotional reaction to conditioned behavior? Are you going to say something in specific with high blood pressure, or is that just an abstraction here? And that's as far as we go.
So when you're describing the determinants like this, so this is just the factor, right? So you know that there is some emotional reaction. This does not say what is the solution. This part of the process does not say the solution is to say something because of this. There's a whole different set of like next steps that we go through in order to identify first, as the previous questions were, do we want to address it? Or even the first one would be, can we address it? Can we affect someone's emotional response to something? Is it even modifiable? And then after that, we'll be thinking about if we want to address it. If it is addressable, how do we want to address it if we want to address it? And this is not yet the final form of what it's going to look like. This is just the description of that there is a factor and it matters.
Yeah, probably you and then the next can be clearer.
Sure. Yeah, so after we go through the set of factors that are important in this particular behavior, we would usually go to the next step, which is describing what is the function of our intervention. And we're using the same methodology by Susan McKay, and this methodology describes those intervention functions that are available to us. So our intervention might be aiming to educate someone, or it might be aiming to persuade someone, or incentivize someone. And you can see the list. There actually are, there's one more factor or intervention function starting this year, which is need satisfaction. So this would be just like, what is our intervention trying to do? Like kind of high level. And in case of our intervention, since we outlined to you what the process was like, our next step in the process would be to choose what functions do we think apply to this particular intervention. So education, persuasion, incentivization, training, environmental restructuring, and enablement. And there'll be more examples about what those are and what those look like in this intervention that you will see later. Next step in the theoretical process, sort of before we go into design and creative part, is to identify what are the active ingredients of the intervention and what are the specific techniques that we're going to be applying in the process that would be in the core of our intervention and would be, again, based on the theories and based on the frameworks that we're looking at. So, for example, in case of behaviors such as self-monitoring, there are certain theories that were studied in this context, such as social cognitive theory and self-determination theory. There are some techniques that we were looking at through behavioral economics lens or game mechanics. And there's also the toolkit that we have, which you probably could not see, but trust me, it's great. It is the 93 Behavior Change Techniques Toolkit. It's a taxonomy. What it gives you the standardized set of techniques or active ingredients. If you look at this paper, it's also University College London, Susan McKay, 93 Behavior Change Techniques V1. You can see what is the technique, what is the definition, and what is the example of how it's applied. And there are many different ways you can use this taxonomy, but the goal with which it was created was there's so much behavioral research out there, especially in recently in digital health interventions, that sometimes it's really hard to understand how you can replicate something. So if someone did an intervention in hypertension, and I'm looking at it, I want to be able to understand what exactly they did, what are the core components or behavior change techniques they used. So in order to understand this, we need to speak the same language, and this is why this taxonomy was created. And this is why it's so useful for us, because when we're building the intervention, we're thinking about what are the components that we want to put so that we are at the same time creating a case or evidence for someone else to look at whether this techniques or this methods were appropriate, and they can replicate them. So in case of self-monitoring for hypertension, there are certain techniques that were appropriate. So we're going to go through a couple examples, but you can see that it's not necessarily all the list that you have to choose to deploy your intervention. There's always the trade-off, actually. So if you don't put enough of behavior change techniques in the intervention, you're always, you might miss the right determinant. You might not address the right factor that is the most important. If you put in too many techniques in the intervention, what happens is that it becomes a really burdensome for the person to go through your intervention. It might become a full-time job for the person to just do your intervention if you put all 90 in there. So there's a good balance, and usually it's around 8 to 12 to 16 techniques that are the most appropriate and hit the right determinants.
And they're also mapped, I think, to, and these are some examples, but basically the nature of that technique fits better with different types of goals that you're trying to achieve and behaviors that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, which also comes from evidence and social science research, which you can have access to. So if you try to combine this all together and how those all pieces fit, you would be able to look at it. I think this is a good perspective, but thinking about the behavioral determinant that we had in this map with capabilities, opportunities, and motivation. One of those behavioral determinants was opportunity, having a blood pressure cuff. So when we're thinking about the intervention function, what is it trying to achieve? It is trying to restructure the environment through the behavior change technique that is adding object to the environment. So we can actually describe it really well if we were to write a paper or tell another behavioral scientist, what did we do? We added an object to the environment. Same for the skills to be able to measure blood pressure. Skills was under the capabilities. So if we're thinking about the function, what are we trying to achieve with our intervention that is aiming to change skills? We're trying to train a person. And we would be able to do it with this behavior change techniques that you can see here, which are provide instructions on how to perform a behavior, apply verbal persuasion about capabilities, provide the biofeedback, and provide social support, which is practical in this case, clinician or registered nurse. Do you guys have any questions? Okay.
All right, so now lots of theory, lots of words. I'm sorry, the slides are probably a little small to see from the back, but now we'll take you through how those behavior change techniques actually kind of fit into the real experience of the app and the service. So this is just a high-level view to give you a sense of how the shape of the intervention. So we kind of get a checklist, basically, from that whole process of things we want to include from our toolkit. And then we start thinking about just what are the pieces that we can realistically roll out, how do these all fit together. And in the case of ImagineCare, kind of back to that human clinician piece, we talk about it as not a technology solution necessarily, but really a human solution that's enabled by technology. So we have a mobile app and sensors that allow kind of management of health and chronic conditions. We have data that gets mapped through the cloud in evidence-based pathways that are kind of logic trees based on medical research. And then there's this human element, these health navigators and nurses. Health navigators are kind of like health coaches, and they provide 24/7 support. So they are available anytime that you might need them, over the phone, via chat, and they're kind of getting alerts through this system to reach out if needed. So I'll walk you kind of through the patient journey of how this actually plays out. So the business model is basically B2B2C. A large entity like a hospital system or a self-insured employer group would kind of pay to sign up a lot of folks, and then they would be given the opportunity to enroll, completely voluntary, and kind of coming from a trusted source. So one of those behavior change techniques we saw was credible source. So these are all kind of generic terms that That taxonomy was created through a Delphi card sort exercise, basically, so iteratively talking to experts in behavior change field to come up with this common vocabulary. So they'll all sound very generic, but when we look at this kind of generic list, that kind of serves as a pile of lenses or inspiration cards in a way as we're kind of brainstorming the design solution. So another thing we see here in the email invitations, even first step, is social comparison. We've got the testimonials. There's a material incentive is another behavior change technique. So free stuff. Who doesn't like free stuff? And then there's information about the health consequences. And then practical social support. From the very first communication you get, there's a human that you can contact directly if you need help. And back to interventions not necessarily being digital, these same techniques can be rolled out, in a human conversation. If it's a hospital system, it may be a staff member in the doctor's office who kind of delivers this information, but through a conversation. So the next step after you sign up, there's a welcome kit, and the main intervention functions with this piece are the environmental restructuring idea of just putting objects in the environment. So provide a blood pressure cuff, knock that barrier out of the way right away. And then that material reward piece again. There's a guided setup process then. So in that box, a printed piece of material, which right away has a social reward is another behavior change technique. So congrats, you've taken that first step. And we've made sure to just kind of bring that positive reinforcement at every step of the process. There are prompts and cues, again, very generic terms, but really helpful in just kind of providing that common vocabulary in the design process, and instructions on how to perform the behavior. Let's see, there's also a discrepancy between current behavior and goal is another behavior change technique. So this idea of kind of pointing out that you said you were going to do one thing and you didn't do it, add some social support. Can we help you get there? And we kind of combine those two techniques. So taking the first reading, again, very practical. Thinking about training is kind of a big intervention function here to overcome that barrier of physical capability of building those skills to use the blood pressure monitor. So instructions, we get some feedback on behavior and social reward, behavior change techniques folded into there, prompts and cues again. And then as we kind of get into a routine, we have self-monitoring via both active sensors like a blood pressure cuff where you actually have to do something, or passive sensors like an activity band. And there, with those passive sensors, we're using the behavior change technique, conserving mental resources. So trying to take as much burden off the person so it's easy for them to change their behavior. We also have reminders, which is a form of action planning, another technique. Self-monitoring behavior is basically engaging in that process of looking at the data, looking at the goal for the outcome. So in addition to having a goal for the behavior, I'm going to take my blood pressure daily. We also have the outcome of the goal, outcome of the behavior. So I have a specific target that was prescribed by my physician that I need to match. So agreeing to a care plan is a really important step, and again, bringing that human element in and kind of having a conversation with a nurse or a health navigator to plan your actions, to commit to goals, and to kind of create this behavioral contract, which is another technique. And also there's this element of having a credible source, of having a clinician who's kind of guiding you through this process. All of these things, these little elements, these little techniques build up to increase the probability that your behavior will change. So once we've got our plan in place, we're starting to track. All of that data behind the scenes is being processed through these care pathways. And we get feedback. We get feedback on the outcomes of our behavior itself. Hey, you have actually done what you said you were going to do. We get a little social reward when that's acknowledged. And we get feedback on the outcomes of the behavior as well. So, hey, you actually, your blood pressure is trending great, or it's doing
What is the social reward? Is that just a prompt or something for the machine?
Yeah, so social reward, the technique, or social reward in the system specifically here?
What does the patient experience when you say they get a social reward?
Sure, yeah, so social reward, the behavior change technique, it doesn't have to come from a person specifically, but it's that sense of, I've been acknowledged for doing something well. So in this case, the particular example on the first chat screen is actually an automated chat message that you get. So through these pathways, it's kind of a chat bot that knows that, hey, you've gotten your blood pressure on point for a few days and you're doing great, so we send you a little message. But you may also get that from a human, depending on what the trend is and what the data
Or
is.
another example, not in healthcare, you use Facebook.
Yeah.
So on Facebook, before you post something, you anticipate that some of your friends might like it, right? That's the social incentive. That's like anticipation of the reward. And then someone likes it.
Those don't work for me.
Okay,
I don't pay
whatever
attention
else.
to stuff like that.
And then someone
Yeah, I
likes
think
it, so
I
it's
would not
reward.
I would not feel rewarded by a message from a bot.
Right.
To me, social means human contact.
That is the
So much
practical.
more
Yeah.
powerful.
Yeah, and that's definitely something that we've seen here, and actually we tested a number of these messages and got like a slide. The next, you're ahead of me. It's perfect.
But one of the things that I want to point out is that the term itself can be interpreted in many, many different ways. So, for example, you were saying, like, I would not be personally satisfied by this reward. There might be a whole bunch of people, a whole big audience, target audience that we're trying to target that are not satisfied by this kind of reward. And our goal as designers is early on in the process to identify that that's going to be a really wrong behavior change technique in this context for these people because it's not going to work. So that's something that we're going to learn either from interventions that were described by other behavioral scientists when they were working with a similar group of people, or by us, by going and talking to people and knowing that that's just not going to work for them.
So yeah, before I get to those specific examples, and one of the big parts of the messaging in this experience comes from self-determination theory, which Olga mentioned earlier. And self-determination theory looks at fundamental human needs of a need for to feel competent, to feel like you have autonomy, you have control over what you're doing, you have the freedom to choose. And relatedness, of connectedness to other people and organizations. So we kind of have guidelines that are pretty general for writing messaging as far as language that supports autonomy. So we want to lean that way. We want to lean away from messaging that is controlling, that's dictating what to do, and try to empower people. So we did some testing of messaging with users to see basically what would be receptive, and this is all qualitative. Basically showed concepts of what messages would be and talked through kind of which would you prefer and why, and kind of probed into some of that reasoning. So this first message I'll just read since it's quite small. But scenario, you've achieved a milestone in your health and wellness goals. Which message would you rather receive? The first A here is, you met your activity goal. Great job. And it's from ImagineCare team, sort of a generic avatar. Second message is from Karen, human face. Hi, this is Karen. You've been doing a fabulous job meeting your activity goals. Keep it up. So now I'm sure we've probably all experienced something like message A, these very generic messages that come that we kind of know that they're automated. So people very clearly preferred the human face. It felt like someone was watching over them, that they were being supported. It was friendly, more personable, more not automated sounding. So this kind of led us to question, like, if we're sending automated messages, we know it's just a practical reality of, like, we can't always have everyone respond to every situation, human scale issues. Should we put a face on this to make it more effective, to make it feel like it's coming from a human? And this was a big discussion we had early on, and the organization decided that they really valued transparency, and they did not want to mislead users into thinking that this was a human, even though it was a bot. They were just not okay with that. So it was an interesting decision that, potentially maybe damages the efficacy of that message, but they really do not feel right misleading people that way.
Do you build any intelligence into the automated chatbot message so that based on, say, the profile and the scenario, you alter the response?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, he asked if there's intelligence built in basically to modify the responses based on the scenario, based on the individual, kind of over time, and that's definitely the long-term goal. I think there's machine learning built into. I'm not the technology person, so but yes, to try to basically hyper-personalize over time. So starting out fairly generic, and then seeing how kind of with A/B testing and things like that over time. And building out more robust profiles for people, what's more effective, what's less effective. So it's set up for experimentation along those lines. So another example of a message that we tested, if you have lung disease and the team can tell that you've been using your inhalers more often, you might get a message, you might respond, and then nothing, and no one liked not being responded to, so kind of obvious there, but like important little things just for the team to note and to think about, because sometimes when you're programming these bots or this logic, that situation just doesn't occur to you, so making sure that we're responding back to people. The second option here basically gives some tips, like, it's good to hear. You're feeling great even though you've been taking your medication more often. Here's some advice. Folks, we're kind of split on these between B and C. C being very basically supportive and almost non-judgmental with just providing those tips right off the bat. People had this kind of reaction of like, oh, well, I already know that. Like, that's actually not that useful to me. Or like they didn't probe into the situation anymore, like they just kind of threw this advice at me. So people kind of lean towards, strangely, the message with less information. So that was something that we took away and said, all right, if we're providing information like that, we want to make sure that we're maybe asking like, hey, do you need some tips or something? And that really fosters that idea of autonomy. So, there's two questions at once. So
Is the grammatical error intentional?
Which one?
I was just checking in because noticed, without a subject, I noticed.
Oh,
I was
goodness.
just checking in because noticed you have been using your inhaler more.
Thank
than
you.
usual.
I never noticed that before.
You can't see it from back there.
All right.
But was that, so it wasn't intentional.
No. I'm wondering if that was in there when we tested it. Oh my gosh. It's more human that way, I guess, with the mistake.
Well, I'm asking you if it was intentional.
That's interesting. Yeah, I never noticed that. So,
You say that option C has less information than option B, but information is defined as basically surprise. The less you knew the message before you heard it, the more information was conveyed. And with unless you're assuming that people haven't heard each of those tips in message B 20 times already, then message B actually has 0 information. Whereas message C has a specific piece of information. It tells you why the message is there. Why did I get this thing today?
yeah.
So in fact, people are preferring C because it has more information, even though it's shorter, and the information is more relevant. It's about them, it's not generic.
Yeah, I love that way of analyzing it. That's good. All right. So one more kind of weird little thing that we tested that I just find interesting is we wanted to make people feel as comfortable as possible. So building that rapport, kind of being able to talk to someone over a video chat if that's something that the patient prefers, if they wanted to move from text to video or get to know someone a little better. So we kind of, in the beginning, we're leaning towards like maybe casual could work, like because the culture of the organization is very friendly, very just trying to build this trusting, comfortable relationship with you. And there's this phenomenon of white coat syndrome where your blood pressure raises when you talk to doctors in the doctor's office, and we're like, is this really the right thing? And people actually preferred the scrubs or the white coat for a nurse because it just brought that air of authority, that kind of trust, that credible source. But then for the health navigators, which are more health coaches, they thought, maybe the branded polo would be appropriate, but since they're not nurses necessarily, but it's still kind of official. So that was a kind of interesting finding where we were glad we didn't go too far off the deep end of being too friendly and too comfortable with folks. So, let's see, how much time do we have left? I'm going to check. It's 8:05.
You have 20 more minutes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll just get through this then. So let's see. So back to, this is kind of on the clinician side. So those folks who are going to be chatting with you are going to be talking to you 24/7 type of environment. We wanted to make sure that their experience was also thought about very thoroughly, because many clinical systems are just not fun. They're not great to work with. They're very clunky. And basically, we wanted to cram a lot of information in here beyond kind of the typical clinical data points, also looking at just the human context of people, their occupation, their relationship status, their favorite animal, their pets, and like different things about their personal life. So we worked really closely with the nurses who would be working here to just prioritize the information, and we managed to get most of what they needed to see onto these two screens. We're really fortunate to work with a dual monitor setup, so we had a lot more real estate than you normally would. And so, like, why do we need all this personal information? When you think about different people and the different barriers and some of those more theoretical models of kind of the environment and capability, thinking about what is going on in a person's life when you're caring for these people 24/7, it just helps. It helps when you're talking through, there's a technique called motivational interviewing where you kind of dig into the barriers that folks are facing and help them work through those. And it's just whether someone is working 9 to 5 or a graveyard shift, kind of understanding the context in which they're encountering barriers to their health is very helpful.
And to that point, again, when we are designing an intervention, whether it's intervention for a specific behavior or a subset of behaviors, what we do and what we encourage everyone to do is to design for the person holistically. So not to think that this intervention happens somewhere in silo. It happens in within the context of this person's life, aspiration, and values that we should care about. We should totally care, and we should design our intervention around this and not the other way around, thinking that the person would fit into whatever we design.
Yeah, and there's a quote from one of our stakeholders early on in the process, and he said, "Every patient is different, so I adjust based on the patient. I communicate differently with my professor patients than with the Harley-riding, gun-loving machinists. But it's the same amount of science. It's not patronizing. So it's really important not to stereotype people, but just to understand what works for them, what doesn't work for them, and the best way of communicating and building that rapport." So results, they did a pilot in 2016, got some pretty solid results along those lines of better health, better cost, better value, and care. So really making strides on that blood pressure front that we dove into, and reducing admissions through that process of, hey, we get this alert and realize that you're trending poorly, we're going to talk to you, kind of triage your symptoms, understand, are your vitals just off a little bit and you're actually going to be okay, or if you're feeling a little dizzy, maybe you need to go see a doctor, or maybe you're not doing great, but you can kind of wait until Monday and go see your PCP, things like that. So also great engagement, and especially the biggest thing I feel like is the satisfaction rating. So really feeling like you've gotten that care, that someone is getting to know you and is there for you. So lots of mushy quotes, which I'll just fluff through right now. But this was a really big one that 89-year-old patient, was using this phone app and this blood pressure cuff, and because there was the health navigator was very patient and just kind of walked through it and made sure that everything was going to work for her. Moving to that inactive status to actually kind of being in remission for a condition, having that under control, and changing lives. So that's what we do it for. Some takeaways, just two here really. What they kind of came to us with, there's all these sensors and all this like technology that's coming out, and we can kind of just get it all out there. But then they also had this sense, and we did too, like we can't just throw technology at the problem. We have to really consider that human element and make sure that we are kind of dividing the labor smartly. So letting machines do what machines are good at and letting humans do what humans are good at. Can a robot really make you feel cherished and cared for? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe depends on the person. I don't know. It would be interesting to see as more research is done with bots and stuff these days. But my suspicion is no. I think we need that human element.
And talking about the research, one main takeaway that I hope you all take from this talk is that you should always look at the evidence and you should always look at the research. Whether you can do your own research or you'll be looking at the secondary research, it's something that was published, something that was done before, because especially in the healthcare, it's so important to know that you're not harming people with your intervention, and just because you're trying to change something, assuming that it's going to change it for the better, is totally an assumption. There's no guarantee that your even positive and good behavioral intervention is going to do this. That's why it's always good to look at what has been done before, how do people in different target audiences responded to this intervention, and iterations, and piloting things, and trying this little bits of techniques and ingredients to see how does that work, to understand better what works, what doesn't work. So there's so much that was published about behavioral interventions in many different areas, and I would highly encourage you to look at this first.
Yeah, and that might seem obvious, but we just have seen a lot of design, a lot of startups out there who just think that everything they're doing is new, and people don't seem to realize there's a base of evidence out there. And some of it is that vocabulary, we're so excited to find this standard taxonomy because it's a way that you can find the information that other people have used or have come up with and the things that have been studied. And obviously medical science constantly growing. It's not always firm. It's not always this is the answer. A lot of it is small samples, and you have to really look critically at it. But just taking the time to see what's out there first. That's all. So that's it. Thank you.
That's great, thanks. Maybe the other microphone is working right now.
Treasure.
I'm going to sneak in and ask my own question first. One thing I was wondering is how far, given that the human element is so important for to see that the clinician is, touching you with their authority and with their care and so on. I wondered how far you might be able to go in the direction of, instead of having the smartphone generate the social reward, to how far you can go in the direction that is used in call centers already, of the clinician has their responses all queued up and they can kind of go out automatically in the name of the clinician.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How much does the clinician have to be in the loop to do a true, transparent acknowledgement?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think they're doing some degree of pre-scripted responses, but it's not the preference. I think to scale, that's got to be part of it. But yeah, that's a good question.
I'm not sure that the mic is working.
Oh.
It's not. Sorry. So, okay, I'll just speak out loud. when we think about different diseases, when we think about different types of audience, we're going to be answering this question totally different. If you think about mental health, the human aspect,
The human aspect in the intervention is healing by itself. The person is looking for another person to listen. He's not looking for an information. Actually, there was a lot of studies that showed that information by itself is not doing anything. But some diseases more than others, some people more than others, we looked at this capabilities, opportunities, and motivations. There are specific techniques that might be able to change someone's motivations much better, like other humans, social support, or the social support as an opportunity. So it all depends on what problem you're solving, what is your audience, what are their opportunities and motivations, and it certainly depends on what kind of disease it is. And we've seen all the different types of things where people are trying to scale up something because it's easier. It's easier to build the machine learning algorithm and robo-advisor for something. But really, like retail industry or consumer product industry versus healthcare is totally different. Like, don't disregard the healing aspect of just human connection.
Yep.
Run the
Give me the mic.
Going back to the behavior categories that you guys mentioned earlier, I could see that having like a device and app could help with, the medication adherence and self-monitoring, all that kind of stuff. But you guys also mentioned the stress and psychological health, and I was just wondering how the interventions that you guys design would work in terms of that, because that seems to me is harder to like monitor and it's less objective.
Yeah. So is this effective when I hold it like this? All right, cool. So we didn't go into detail, but the stress and mental health aspect of the intervention, there's less evidence around it. It is much fuzzier. So I think they clinically have been approaching it more as data gathering at this point and intervening where they can. So within the app, using PHQ-2, PHQ-9, our standard depression assessment. So there's kind of a quiz feature, got daily questions that they can push it out that way. There's also a passive sensing. There's a group called Health Rhythms that they're collaborating with, and that kind of uses the different sensors in your phone to pick up on how much you're getting out of the house, kind of how much social interaction you're getting by tapping into your microphone. It's like kind of creepy stuff. And we probed a little bit on some of this as to whether there was a creepy factor, but it seemed to balance out. People seemed to be okay with being watched when they knew that they were having issues. Like they kind of wanted someone to feel like they were watching over them. So it's definitely a little more on the experimental side, but that's, again, another reason to have that human element really hands-on and have folks with the appropriate clinical background to be able to kind of step in and take different situations. So.
I just have a process question. How many iterations of prototypes did you go through, and did you have the same users do each prototype, or did you want fresh users each time? And then another question, when you develop personas, did you have experience maps for each one, or just one basic experience map?
Yeah, we didn't, I'll answer them backwards. We didn't do a ton of persona and experience mapping for this because we had kind of worked on some similar solutions before, and Dartmouth Hitchcock had also worked on some similar solutions before, so we kind of already had a base from previous projects. But to the prototyping question, we did concept testing, which was that kind of messages piece, which is a PowerPoint. It wasn't even like a real prototype, just throwing stuff up on the screen. And then they're doing iterative releases of the software, so it was like in pilot and beta testing. So it's kind of more field testing, basically.
So I really like all your emphasis on doing the research and then doing the iterative piloting. That's really great. And congratulations on the outcomes, like that's
Thanks.
everything you hope for when you put all that work into doing all that upfront research and those efforts. I'm wondering if you came away with any surprises? Was there anything that, like, outcomes or results that you were like, whoa, that's not what we were expecting?
That's a good question. I'm going to have to ask the team. Yeah, nothing is coming to mind at the moment. Other than some of the things I mentioned already, of just like the different message testing and like the clothing and stuff, like that really surprised me that people were like, I want the white coat. Makes me feel better, so.
So I have a question regarding how long was the pilot? Did you measure the engagement over time? Did you see when the technology novelty wears off? Anything happens there?
Yeah, I don't have the exact dates. I think it was 3 months. I think maybe 6. It might have been 3. It was last year. But it was a matched control group. So they looked at a lot of it was based on claims data from Dartmouth-Hitchcock because it was within the Dartmouth-Hitchcock population. But yeah, it's still ongoing. So I think the idea is to get longer term data eventually, but hasn't been that long yet. So.
What was the sample size?
It was over 2,000, I think 2,700 maybe, I think, something like that. It's small on one of the slides.
Will these slides be available?
We can probably post them. I have to check, but there's a video as well. Which,
I know, but I can't read them.
yeah.
I
Yeah.
was going to ask you who made the font choice and why. But,
Sorry, the screen's a little smaller than I thought, but I haven't been here in a while.
All the system outcomes they were looking for, were they all things where you can measure improvement in a short amount of time, like blood pressure, or were any of them like managing a condition that you're not going to be able to change or for a long time? Like, I understand this was a pilot, but like, someone who's maybe waiting for a kidney, they could be on dialysis for years while they're waiting, and if there's anything like this could help them?
Yeah, so I think the populations that they chose, they all had some degree of shorter term outcomes. Heart failure is terminal eventually, so it's more about, yeah.
So this is going to be, it's a long term, this is a long term solution.
Yeah, so, I think it was starting with, back to those kind of factors of how they decided on the population, kind of what could potentially make the biggest impact at the time and be measurable and be evidence-based.
But
yeah,
okay, Mike.
But in general, if you think about outlining the outcomes, there will be certain outcomes that will be more long-term, just naturally. So if you're thinking about HbA1c, like even if you try to measure it a week later after your intervention, you will not see the change, not because your intervention is not successful or good, just because it doesn't change that fast. So there are certain aspects that are just short-term and long-term because that's biological reason. And those are more of like, if you think about short-term outcomes, so if we design an intervention, knowing what do we expect and what is our logic model. For example, we put in there something for motivation. We can measure motivation as a proxy, as a short-term outcome because we're trying to change it, because we have a hypothesis that through changing motivation, we're going to change this aspect of the behavior. So that could be the shortest outcome. We can measure it 2 weeks later and do the follow-up 4 weeks later and 1 month later and see how it changes or progresses, or confidence, or self-efficacy, or satisfaction. So anything that was in our logic model as potentially measurable short-term versus long-term, something that like hypertension would not change immediately even if it was successful.
Yeah, and one other thing, I think the hypothesis is that this human element and the sort of a highly personalized, adaptable nature will address the engagement cliff that we see in a lot of these kinds of behavior change solutions when it's just an app and people get tired of using it after 6 months. So it's not updated yet, but that's, and I think we also built into the pathways and the protocols re-engagement, like being okay with letting people go for a little while, like knowing that everyone kind of needs a break, and having ways to kind of re-engage and reach back out and say, hey, are you ready to start working on this again? It's built into the system.
Like going to the gym.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone needs a little break.
Sure, and just another question around outcomes as well. With a mobile device, since Dartmouth Hitchcock has been in this space doing population health, did they have an existing health coach that they were maybe working on paper and then moved it with you to mobile? I'm just kind of curious as to whether or not there's any result comparison maybe between a non-automated model and your model.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a really good question. I think they were developing a lot of the protocols, like they didn't have the protocols all built out, so I don't think there was like a comparable system in place. Yeah, that's a good question. There might be similar ones that you might be able to compare parts, but not
And then
wholesale.
from a standpoint, I know they're newer, and I don't know if either from them or from your other clients. I'm just kind of curious from a research perspective, once you start getting patients engaged and the impact on it, how that then affects your behavioral interventions going forward. Because you're talking about research and what's out there, what's working.
Mm-hmm.
This is a whole new area. I'm just kind of curious if you've thought about how you're going to be incorporating that going forward, 3-5 years from now.
Yeah, as you mentioned, it's dynamic, so there are certain things that change that might not change. So when you think about that, there are two types of evaluation you might be doing. There is the outcomes evaluation, where you're looking purely at is it working, is it not working, and there's always process evaluation. So I think that research could essentially apply to both, improving the process and improving the implementation and improving the outcomes. But for some types of products or services, I think that the first is a lot of times the choice. Once you define what the product is or what the service is, you might be limited to the extent to which you might change the intervention or the product itself. So there are certain limitations to which you can integrate it. So thinking about the mode that you choose, the mode of delivery, thinking about the channel of delivery, like all the different touch points. But you'll certainly be able to keep doing evaluations on the process and improving the process. And then when it comes to integrating research coming from the outcome, because maybe there was something published recently that could significantly improve the outcomes for the specific audience, there'll be two ways to do it, right? First would be to evaluate whether it's potentially at all something that applies to is it relevant? Then there'll be limitations that you'll be looking at. Can I try this? And you'll suddenly start with pilots. You would not recraft and reiterate all your intervention based on this one piece of evidence. If you're interested and you think it's relevant and you think it applies, you would go through the same steps. You would do pilot, iterations, small randomized controlled trials, iterations. So you would not just think that now this is a thing and I'm going to switch to that one, especially if you get good outcomes with your intervention.